And welcome to our webinar. Today, the webinar is on accelerating net zero, talking about how governments can incentivise and supercharge transition. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum and with our knowledge partner today, Deloitte. So in terms of the topic for today, as more and more warnings are given about the urgency of tackling climate change and reducing emissions, reaching net zero is one of, if not the biggest challenge facing governments all around the world. And here in the UK, like many others, the government has set out a roadmap for transitioning the country to net zero by 2050. And this includes ambitious commitments around clean energy generation, reducing energy demand, and greening the economy. In terms of the how all of this is achieved, the government will need to influence and incentivise the whole of society, so citizens, businesses, public bodies, and others. And in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at things such as whether the government has managed to put in place the key building blocks that will be needed for reaching net zero, what more needs to be done to catalyse moves to net zero across the whole of the economy, and the impact that net zero policy might have on public services and what the government needs to do to prepare all of us for that. We have a fantastic panel of speakers with us here today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we'll hear some opening remarks from each of our speakers. But this webinar is also an opportunity for you, the audience, to put whatever questions you have to our panel. So on whichever device you are using, you should see somewhere on that device a Q&A function. From now on, at any point, please use that Q&A function to message in your questions. So whether you've come with questions or whether you hear something that one of our speakers say and that ignites a question in you, please use that Q&A function to message in your question, and we'll get through as many of those as we can by the end of our webinar. So in terms of our great speakers today, first, we have Selwyn Brown, MBE, who is Director of Energy Efficiency and Local Net Zero Building Delivery at the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero. Selwyn has held a number of high-profile policy and delivery roles across several government departments, spanning over the last 30 years. He's currently responsible for policies and regulations aimed at decarbonising the UK's 27 million homes. And Selwyn's also passionate about the civil service itself. He does a lot of work on equality, diversity and inclusion, and is the civil service deputy race champion. Then we will hear from Dr. Stephen Vass, who is manager and net zero lead at the UK Regulators Network. And I'm sure he'll tell us more about that network in a moment, but just to say its current priorities include working across the regulatory community to support consumers through the cost of living crisis and that transition to net zero. Prior to this role, Steve spent over 20 years working in central government and regulators in the UK and abroad. And during his earlier career, he would introduce the government's first approach to evaluating the ecosystem services provided by nature in development decisions. Then we will hear from Charlotte Warburton, who is Head of Transport and Public Sector Sustainability and the Climate Leader at Deloitte. With a background in cross-industry transformation, Charlotte has over 20 years' experience supporting organisations in defining their future strategies and ensuring the success of their complex change programmes. In her current role, she helps government departments understand how they can address their business-critical issues in the most sustainable manner possible. Her passion is bringing private and public sector organisations together to take a whole system view on the climate challenge. And then last, but by no means least, we'll hear from Neil Hornby, who is Chief Executive of the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, CFAS, which is the government's marine and freshwater science agency. Again, I'm sure we'll hear more about the work of CFAS, but it works in the UK and around the world to provide scientific research, data and analysis to help governments tackle climate change and promote nature recovery. Prior to his current role, Neil spent over 20 years working in central government in the UK, most recently as the Marine Director in DEFRA, and with other senior roles, including overseeing flood risk management policy and nuclear energy policy. So I'm sure you will agree with me, we really do have a great panel here with us today. Please take this opportunity to pick their brains, to send in all the questions that you've had. And as I say, we will get to those once we have heard from our speakers in their opening remarks. So with that, Selvin, I'm going to come over to you and invite you to kick off our presentations.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and can I thank you and your colleagues for inviting me to speak with all of you today. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here amongst this distinguished panel to talk about the government's net zero plans, and very specifically about the heat and buildings portfolio that I'm part of running. And obviously goes without saying, I'm incredibly passionate. I could get passionate about a paper bag, about the agenda. I've actually just got back to London. I've been in Manchester for a couple of days with all of our partners at the Net Zero Unlock Awards, where one of the programs that we run won one of the awards. The UK has set an ambitious legal target to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 and by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels. That is well known. The plans are set out in the net zero strategy published in 2021. There was an accompanying strategy, which was the heat and building strategy, which I'm responsible partly for delivering. That set out a very clear pathway of policies, regulations, and delivery proposals backed by financial government funding and to deliver against that pathway. Last year, the government went further by committing to reducing 15% of energy reduction by 2030 to meet that target. Across all the buildings and industries that operate within those buildings. So that's heavy industry as well as your sort of hairdresser on the high street. And my minister, Callahan, and Dame Alison Rose, the chief executive of NatWest, co-chair a task force which is currently tasked with looking at how we're getting on with those plans, and in particular what more needs to be done to fulfill the 15% ambition and get us really on the way to delivering. I know we're going to get into the conversation about the CCC's annual report, which was published yesterday. As I said to colleagues in Manchester yesterday and my keynote, I particularly welcome that report and the debate around it. So let's have the conversation. Net zero for us is not just about reducing emissions. There are important things here for us about how we sustainably grow the economy. And between 1990 and 2021, the economy has grown by 65%, while we've reduced emissions against that 1990 benchmark by 48%. We are very, very keen to see the green agenda and growth being taken together. It is our expectation, our understanding that in order to decarbonize the building stock that I'm responsible, that we need to create between 250,000 and 300,000 jobs over the next almost decade. And I've been working with lots of organizations who are training people and retaining people and moving them across different parts of the supply chain. I know there are lots of pressures on the supply chain currently. In order to meet the target, we've got to understand where we started from. We have the oldest building stock in Europe. Almost 6 million homes were built before the First World War. That is a larger number than any other country in Europe, and therefore we have to do more than those on the continent in order to deal with our stock. The government has committed £16.6 billion between 2020 and 28. We had an initial 6 billion in SR21. That was to fund and is funding some of my programs like the social housing decarb program and the home upgrade program. We also have extended the £6.6 billion with a levy. It's an old existing program, but we've increased it, the energy company obligation eco. That now delivers £1 billion worth of upgrades in financial costs across 4 years. And the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced an additional 6 billion, making the 16.6 billion for the funding period of 25 to 28. And we will bring forward plans in this autumn statement to extend some of the schemes that we're running already and bring forward additional plans. The Chancellor also announced the Great British Installation Scheme, which from next month will be connected to our front door, our website, and you'll be able to, as it were, self-serve and go and ask an energy company to come and insulate your home for directly yourself, giving you lots of control and agency over what happens and when it happens and how it happens. You know that our plans are to reach EPC-C for all buildings by 2037. We've already reached a tipping point. Over 50% of all buildings are already at EPC-C. We've about 13, 14 years to go, and our current plans, both the policies and the regulations and the capital programs that I run, see us to achieve 750,000 homes a year being upgraded by 25. Now, I know we've got to get to 1 million or just over, but we are closer to delivering against the challenge than possibly people realise. But I'm not declaring victory. It's not job done, but we have got credible plans to achieve those. We take a fabric first approach. We make no apology for that. We do know that we need to deliver clean heat solutions. We need to take the fossil fuel out of heating homes. But in order to do that sensibly, we've got to get it in the right order. We've got to make sure that the thermal comfort and the energy that will be used to heat the home isn't wasted by the heat loss that would happen if we don't do the fabric before we do the heat. We've got very, very clear plans to support households. We've got our .gov.uk where you can already go and check your home against your EPC certificate, or if you don't have one of those, you can simply do some answer some questions. It will tell you what kinds of things need to happen on your home, and in next month you'll be able to connect to the government services to be able to do all of that. I'm probably going to stop there and just close by saying, we are, the minister is, or the whole team is very, very committed to this agenda. We have a fictitious audience, Mrs. Miggins, who has a home in Sheffield, and it could be that she owns the home or she's in private rented sector or in social housing. And we're very much focused on the lived experience of people living in those homes. We're looking at how people are using the technology we're putting in the homes through smart meters. We've got a study with Cambridge University looking at that. And we're very, very, very keen to have the conversation and debate about what more we can do and to make sure that we take the 30% of net zero energy emissions out of the system through the homes that we are decarbonising. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Selwyn. A really good way to start, because I think you've identified, you kind of mentioned the overall strategy, but then identified how big a chunk of it that is in the kind of heat and building strategy. And also, whilst you're not kind of playing down how much more needs to be done, it's quite nice to get a kind of update on some of the progress that's already been made and some of the positives there. So good to hear about the funding kind of security that you've had since the last spending statement. So that's 16.6 billion that you're saying for 25 to 28. Really interesting to hear that already you're over 50% in terms of all buildings meeting the EPCC standards. People in the audience might have thoughts on that, the staging, how you're doing the insulation first and then looking to kind of changing the kind of heating systems themselves. And then also, I think a topic that will come up throughout the other presentations, that importance of giving people control over some of these schemes, but also giving them the information that they need as well to make the right decisions. So great place to start. Thank you so much, Selwyn. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you for the invite and the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be speaking here today on a subject that's really close to my heart. I think we're kind of reflecting pre-meeting, but I did my doctorate, it's actually 25 years ago, believe it or not, in atmospheric physics. And I remember speaking with colleagues around the climate models at the time, and the projections showing the kind of change that we've actually seen being kind of the top range in particular what we've seen around extreme events. So I think that's a real wake-up call to all of us, and it's something that I think gives us a sense of urgency. I know Neil will talk a bit more later on about the science, so I'll stop there. I'll stop indulging myself at that point. But I'm here to talk to you about regulators' role and what we do at the UK Regulators Network in the space of net zero. So I've worked at the UK Regulators Network for the last couple of years. We are a members organisation that represents 14 of the larger regulators in the UK, including Ofwat, Ofcom and Ofgem, the utilities regulators, but also the financial regulators, the CMA and others, including the ICO and ORR. I always miss a few off. Apologies to anyone who's on the call who I missed off. A bit of a caveat, as a members organisation, a lot of what we do has to be in agreement of our members. So I'll talk about what we do and the work we're engaging government with at the moment. But the kind of views I express, a lot of those may be my personal views that I've built through my career. So don't necessarily represent the views of UKR in itself. Our purpose is very much, and what we were set up to do almost 10 years ago, is very much around promoting collaboration across the regulators. As we've grown over time, we've kind of developed much more focus on what effective regulation is and thought leadership around effective regulation and how we can deliver specific things on behalf of our members. Siobhan, you already mentioned our focus areas on cost of living, and in fact yesterday we published a joint statement on forbearance on cost of living with some of our members, particularly around the mortgage crisis. But we've also focused on cost of capital, the price setting regimes that drive infrastructure investment, particularly key to net zero here, as well as the broader net zero agenda. My focus is net zero, coordinating our work on net zero, as well as governance and regulatory reform, which actually are all really quite joined. I think it's fair to say on net zero, our regulators work within the space that Parliament gives them. They are independent and they take a long-term view, but some of our regulators have direct steers and duties on net zero. Others do not, and others interpret it through fiduciary duties, for example, and long-term sustainability of investments in the financial side. And for example, the CMA does a lot of work around substantiating claims, green claims in the market, for example. So our members play different and subtly different roles. And I think it's fair to say that the periphery between what is government policy and what is in the regulatory space is different between each of our members. So this is really quite complex to kind of work across our membership. Our big focus areas on net zero have very much been around mitigation traditionally, but we are focusing now more and more on evaluating the costs and investment needs and how we can promote investment on net zero, the adaptation challenges to infrastructure, and perhaps we can bring this a bit more out in discussion, but the links between vulnerability and net zero, the equality issues here, and in fact, how can you align the necessary change that's needed to rewire the economy to protect and really minimize the impacts on consumers and actually protect the most vulnerable so that they realize the benefits first. Selvin was talking about energy efficiency is particularly key amongst that. So I wanted to finish on one of the things we've been working on most recently is with government around the response to the Skidmore review. One of the many recommendations of Skidmore was for government to set up a forum across regulators to coordinate signals sent to business and investors. And the government on the 30th of March actually committed to work with the UK Regulators Network on that forum. We see this really as an opportunity to fill a bit of a gap in the machinery of government, to bring together government and regulators across that periphery, which, as I say, is different for each of our members, and across sectors, to promote systems thinking. So interested what Charlotte has to say on this, to promote systems thinking, coordination and alignment of actions and decisions to deliver our overall 2050 target. We see this as kind of particularly key when we're kind of working on what is this kind of complex systems problem, where decisions can quite easily fall between government and regulators and different sector regulators. So this is really new to net zero governance and really about working out how we can best plug that kind of machinery of government and net zero governance gap moving forward. So that's broadly what I wanted to say today. I've got a lot more I can say, but I'll look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So really good to have this different, I think, perspective coming in. I don't think we've had the kind of voice from the regulators on our webinars before when we've been dealing about these issues. As you say, a bit of a gap there maybe in terms of a voice in that kind of conversation. So as you say, quite complicated in terms of your membership and kind of whether they have a direct role in this or whether their role is more indirect in this. But interesting what you say about that move from traditionally from mitigation to now looking more at adaptation, and in particular the protection of the most vulnerable. And then very much, I think, promoting that message that this has to be all about collaboration across kind of sectors, across industries, and the importance of alignment and taking that whole systems approach. And you said Charlotte might have some views on that. So thank you, Stephen. And now I'm going to hand over to Charlotte for her remarks.
Yeah, that's a really nice segue. And like Selvin and Stephen, I'm really excited to be here. My passion is national sector level transformation. How do we make change stick? So there's something really dear to my heart. And I think I'm hopefully going to complement and build on Selvin and Stephen's points. When I think about how we accelerate this transition, and it actually builds on the comment made earlier about the green agenda linked to growth, I think about this topic in terms of the biggest economic opportunity of the 21st century. And I think when we talk about this in private and public sector, that is the theme that's coming out. This is the next version of the industrial revolution. Like, this is 5.0. This is the biggest economic opportunity we need to get behind. But Stephen, to your point, it is a really wicked problem to solve. And we do need that whole systems view. And hopefully we'll get into it in the questions, but my sense of how we tackle that whole systems view is to map the complexity and look at the interaction points, and then really pick the key kicks and shifts we can make to trigger us forward. And the work that Selvin's doing with energy transition is an example of that, but it's not the only example. And what are the rest that we need to come round together as a nation? So it's really, for me, about how do we tackle that? And I think about it in 3 or 4 lenses. The first would be around, taking strategy and policy and turning it into delivering outcomes at pace. We do have a lot of strategy and policy, and I know there is noise out there, we need more, but my stance is we've got enough to get going, let's get going. And I think the work that the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero have demonstrated is an example of turning that strategy and policy into action. But we need to do more of it. And when we hear that, we need more regulation and policy before we get started, I think that's a significant missed opportunity cost. There's a lot we can get going right now. There are enough strategies and visions out there to give us the North Star that we need to lean into. So I think we're all accountable for that. Yes, we may need amendments to the policy and regs, but we all need to be accountable for our own operational emissions in the businesses we work in. And how do we signal to the market through how we procure and go to market what we expect of supply chain to help us on that journey? My second lever would be around the convening power across government, private sector and citizens. So Selvin talked about the Climate Change Committee report that's come out. It's not new news. I think the UN said to us in their latest IPC report 6 months ago that there's lots of data in there, but the overarching message is we need to go faster than we are already. And there's this sense of urgency that we really need to grasp. And my belief is you don't grasp that urgency separately. We really have to come together and have some uncomfortable conversations, right? On how we really join up and maybe forgo some of our own direct objectives to get the bigger good. And that convening power for me is essential if we're going to move. The third would be around, of course, leveraging technology and things like green energy to trigger these kicks and shifts so that we can leap forward. So things like, how do we integrate all renewables to build us this low carbon energy system? And Selvin gave some examples of the jobs that the work he's doing is creating. There's a bigger question, like how are we going to fill all the skills? How are we going to find the people to power this transition and then maintain it? There's a great opportunity there, and we should be grasping that today. The fourth would be around, and this is something particularly close to my heart, is that changing of behaviours from citizens and organisations. And when I think about this problem, like the crux of it is, how do we incentivise organisations and individuals to put this topic at the heart of what they do, not the bolt-on the side on top of all the other objectives we have. And that's really hard, right? Because there's loads of headwinds around us in this climate, the war on Ukraine, cost of living crisis. Like, how do we demonstrate that by solving your critical issues in a sustainable way, it's actually a better outcome to solving your issue and for the planet? So it comes back to the triple bottom line of people, planet, and then profit. But actually, how do we demonstrate that? Because we talk it, but we have to demonstrate it. And linked to that, it's about the nudging of behaviours. So what can the government do in terms of engagement strategy with citizens, or making data available so people can have the power of information in their hands? Stephen, you talked about the Skidmore report. You know, we talk in there about a carbon calculator. How do citizens really understand the impact of their actions, and how can they better improve those with the right grants and support? And then my last point I would leave us with, just for the audience to noodle, would be around this kind of the concept of circularity. Lots of us talk out of it, and we talk of a circular economy, but it really is a mindset shift, right? So fundamentally, it's about how do we maximize the capacity of what we've got versus demanding and creating more. And that makes us have some uncomfortable choices as organizations and individuals. We've recently done a report in Deloitte with the market and came up with 6 scenarios. Not going to go through them all. One was around circular built environment, which I think Selvin's touched on. Retrofitting our buildings, resource efficient building practices. If we got all that right, you could reduce emissions by circa 20%. Another example would be transport. And one of, as you said in my intro, Siobhan, transport's my other day job and I love it dearly. How do we rethink transport and mobility? So how do we reduce travel? But to do that, we have to green the infrastructure we've got. We need to have really good public services in transport. And we need to think about really embracing different business models, you know, car sharing, ride sharing, etc. But if we did all that, you could potentially reduce transport's emissions by circa 10%. So when I came earlier about what are the kicks and shifts, there are some things we can do in our grasp. It's not all too hard. There is a lot we can do, but I think we really need to come together to do it.
Charlotte, thank you so much. You mentioned the report there at the end. I'm sure we can share that with everybody. Is that okay? We'll make sure that we do that with everybody that's in the audience. But I love your 4. You started by saying this is the biggest economic opportunity that we have and we should seize it. And then your kind of 4 issues there. So turning strategy and policy into delivery, but at pace, really stressing that urgency. Going back to Selvin mentioned the CCC report, and I think the first recommendation there was more urgency is needed. So definitely something about not going fast enough. And then the convening power you mentioned across the public and private sectors and citizens, how can we harness that so that we're all doing this together? The leveraging of technology, so how do we use all of that to leap forward on those kind of greening energy? But what are the skills that we need, the people that we need to be able to do that? And then really all of that at the end that you talked about, the importance of changing behaviours. So how can we, when other priorities in, make sure that we keep climate change right at the top and address all of those others in the most sustainable way, but also, as you said, nudging people, but also nudging policymakers to think about services, delivering of services in a completely different, much more sustainable way. So much in there for us to unpick. And thanks to the audience, we've already got questions coming in, so keep sending those in. And we will get to those after we have heard from our final speaker today, Neil. Over to you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Siobhan, and good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be with you today, and I think have a chance to share with you some thoughts just from a more scientific perspective and a little bit about the role of the wider environment and nature in some of this. So, as you said at the start, Siobhan, I'm Neil Hornby. I'm the Chief Executive of CFAS, which is the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. We're the government marine science agency, and we sit under DEFRA and carry out a wide range of environmental monitoring and research. As you might expect, a lot of our work focuses on climate mitigation and adaptation, with our scientists undertaking work nationally and internationally and being part of scientific bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which Charlotte just mentioned. I think probably the first thing to say from a scientific perspective is that supercharging the transition to net zero is absolutely vital. Again, reflecting on what Stephen was saying, when I was first studying environmental science, again, about 25 years ago, we used to talk then about, what could happen if climate change occurred, and we were making projections about the future. We're now past that point. We're already seeing the impact of climate change on our environment, both here in the UK and around the world. For example, currently in the UK, we're experiencing a marine heat wave with sea temperatures around 4 degrees higher than they should be at this time of year. And that's in addition to last September, our CFAS Marine Smart Buoys recorded the highest ever sea temperature in UK waters at 21 degrees centigrade. And these sorts of changes put significant stress on our environment, and the science tells us that we can still stop the worst effects of climate change, but only if we stick to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and accelerate this transition to net zero. I think probably everyone on this call recognises that we are facing a climate crisis, but I think I also want to highlight that we're currently experiencing a biodiversity crisis as well. And that's even before the worst effects of climate change are felt. Many scientists believe we're in the middle of a mass extinction event, having lost around 70% of the total amount of global wildlife in the last 50 years, and currently around 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. I would argue that these crises are inextricably interlinked. You can't deal with the climate crisis without tackling the biodiversity crisis, and you can't address the biodiversity crisis without tackling the climate crisis. So that's why in the context of today's webinar title, I want to make 2 points. The first is that it matters how we get to net zero, not just how quickly that we get there. We need to do so in a way that protects the wider environment and not damages it further in the process. And the second point is that we need to recognise that part of the transition has to involve nature. Decarbonising the energy supply, transport systems and our buildings is absolutely essential, but so are nature-based solutions that protect the ability of the planet to play its part in helping us mitigate and adapt to climate change. On my first point, as we know, transitioning to net zero will involve some major changes to our energy supply, our infrastructure, our buildings and our transport, and we've heard about some of that already this morning. We're going to need nature-positive engineering solutions as part of this transition, whether that's in how we design our buildings, how we build our new infrastructure, or even things like ensuring we fully understand the potential impacts of deep sea mining for rare earth that could supply electric vehicle batteries. We need to be looking for solutions that are both nature and climate positive. Now, fortunately, I think more and more governments and businesses do understand this, and we are seeing progress. For example, here in the UK, in CFAS, we're working closely with EDF to build environmental considerations into the design of the new nuclear power stations at Hinkley and Sizewell. We're also working with the Crown Estate and the offshore wind sector to ensure offshore wind development is sustainable for the wider marine environment. But as I said, it's not just about making infrastructure nature positive. To achieve net zero, we're going to need nature-based solutions as well. I'm going to use the marine environment as an example, as that's the area we work on in CFAS, but the same is very much the case on land, and some of those aspects were drawn out in the Committee on Climate Change's report yesterday. So to start with, I make people aware that the ocean is absolutely vital for regulating global climate. It currently absorbs about 30% of the emissions, carbon emissions that we release, and about 90% of the temperature. And it also contains huge amount of stored carbon in habitats like mangroves, kelp, seagrass, as well as locks up in seafloor sediments. It's been doing a pretty good job for a long period of time of helping to regulate our climate. But our seas are subject to a number of pressures that risk reducing their ability to continue to perform these functions. Some of these are linked to climate, such as warming water, and warm water is less effective at absorbing carbon dioxide, as well as causing damage to habitats like coral reefs. But when you add to that other pressures from things like marine pollution, increasing pests and diseases, invasive species and overfishing, you reduce the resilience of ecosystems and the climate functions they can provide. So if we want to achieve net zero, my argument is we need our marine and terrestrial ecosystems to recover so that they can be more resilient to the impacts of climate change, as well as potentially play a greater role in absorbing carbon. So again, in the marine space, recent international agreements to place 30% of the global ocean in a marine protected area by 2030. And just last week, adoption of a new UN treaty, which allows protected areas in high seas for the first time, are important milestones, as are efforts by DEFRA to establish highly protected marine areas in the UK for the first time, where no human activity can occur. In conclusion, we need to accelerate the transition to net zero, but we need to do so sustainably and recognise the essential role of nature in helping us get there. Thank you.
Neil, thank you so much. Again, really, really good to have that different perspective. And I think what you said about we're not just in a climate crisis, we're also in a biodiversity crisis. So I think increasingly we need to make sure that these conversations are connected and that those two agendas are coming together. Your two key points there really important, that it's not just about getting to net zero with urgency, it's about how we get to net zero and making sure that those solutions, even if we're looking at things like renewables, for example, aren't done at detriment to the environment, to nature. So looking for solutions that are both, I love the phrase that you said, nature and climate positive. I think a real key message there to come away from what you said. And then just really some of those startling statistics that you gave about the importance of the ocean and our marine environments for kind of regulating our climate, regulating temperature. And we really, really need to be paying much more attention to what we do in these areas. Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you so much to all of you for giving those fantastic opening presentations. I'm going to actually go straight over to the audience questions because we've got so many coming in. There are a couple very specific ones back on some of what you have said. So I think, Selvin, there was a question that came in directed to you, I think, which was about, you were talking about kind of things that needed to be done to buildings. And Gwen Evans has asked, how can we motivate landlords to sign up to some of these schemes? So you mentioned some of the schemes that were available. From my experience, they're reluctant to invest money into their properties. So is it a question of motivating landlords, Selvin, or are they being forced to do some of this?
So it's a bit of both, isn't it? So there are some landlords out there that have already achieved EPCC. They spent, say £10,000 to upgrade their home because they believe in the agenda. I mean, I should say one thing and then answer the question. The government's approach, broadly speaking, is to regulate all three sectors: social sector, private rented sector, and homeowners, and to pay for those households that can't afford to upgrade the homes. So households that are typically in fuel poverty or are marginally at the margins of society and are off the gas grid, we have specific programs for those homes. So what are we doing with landlords? As you say, the government has committed to improving the private rented stock in 26 to be completed by 28, from EPCE, where we're currently at, to EPCC. I saw some research with the team this morning which said that 55% of households surveyed in our SHDF Wave 1 program said that that had dealt with all of their damp and mold issues, and there were talking heads as part of the research, which showed, it will be published shortly, which showed families talking about the fact that the husband and wife could sleep in their bedroom for the first time that winter, for example, following the work that's been done. And we've got to remember this is all about what we're doing. 30% of our home upgrade scheme, which is designed for typically rural homes off the gas grid, where that householders' heating is using coal, if you can imagine that, and oil, it is designated for the private rented sector, and the 30% isn't completely utilized. So there's still quite a bit of behavior change and nudging the landlords to comply. But with those regulations coming in 26, I believe that they will do so. I also think it's important for us to be thinking about the unit in which that household is. So, we've been doing the work that I've done with Deloitte over the 15% energy reduction sprint with number 10 over the last few months, focuses on a whole building approach. So if you imagine the flats above the chip shop on the high street, typically that building will have pretty much similar insulation. It will have similar heating solutions. We should be thinking about both the small business and the flats above it in the solutions that we're seeking to resolve.
Thanks, Elvin. There are other questions coming in for individual speakers, but linked to this one, I think, I'm going to go to the question from Lauren, who says, and I think this was in response to your presentation, Charlotte, about changing behaviours, how important that is, but she has asked, where is or should there be accountability as well as incentivising? So it's a bit what you said, Selwyn, there's a bit of nudging, but also ultimately there will be a regulatory kind of environment where you have to comply. So your thoughts, all of you, especially in light of kind of how fast we need to go, has the government got the balance right on incentivising, whether it's citizens or businesses, versus holding them to account and kind of requiring people to do things? Stephen, I'm going to come to you because I think this is probably right up your street in terms of have we got that balance right at the moment?
Again, in some areas, perhaps, and in other areas not. I mean, it's interesting. We were talking in advance, thinking about, kind of schemes that have succeeded in the past. And a good example coming from the energy sector myself was around the feed-in tariff scheme, which succeeded beyond kind of our wildest projections at the time. And in fact, it succeeded so much that we ended up with so much solar PV being put on rooftops in the southwest of the UK that the grid was being overloaded. And in fact, the grid hadn't been built for a system where basically electricity was flowing outwards from housing rather than inwards and trying to flow back into the rest of the country. And there was kind of a big constraint in the grid. So effectively, then you constrain that. So you're wasting electricity that's being generated. So that's an example of where, a scheme has worked well and possibly too well. And actually the government response to that was eventually to get rid of feed-in tariffs. I think government has probably learned the lesson of that and is much more nuanced now in approaches to incentivising moving forward. But of course, there's this big challenge of limited funds in the economy. And this is where I would link all of this back to the kind of question of how we deliver the transition and how we do it in a just and equitable way as well. And it's good to hear Selwyn talk about the government policy in terms of favouring those who are at least able to afford insulation and those things that can actually directly benefit consumers through reducing energy costs. But I think we also need to be applying the same thinking now as we're kind of transitioning towards a vehicle fleet that is entirely electric for passenger vehicles. How do you deal with those customers who are left on legacy diesel and petrol vehicles when you have fewer and fewer diesel and petrol stations? The cost will go up. It's kind of how do we balance those kind of just transition issues to maintain consent, public consent that will be needed for what is a huge transition in the economy. And it goes back to Charlotte's point of kind of how do you nudge people, but kind of how do you also stop mis-selling? And this is where I mentioned the CMA's work, but it's particularly important that we keep a really strong enforcement and compliance eye on bad practice that goes on out there, and we kind of stamp it out ASAP.
Yeah. Thanks.
That's my thoughts on that from a regulator's perspective.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, Charlotte. So 2 points you made. One was people shouldn't sit back and wait for regulation. But then in light of Lauren's questions, if people are doing that, how should government be incentivising them and holding them to account?
It's hard, isn't it? And I think about it, when I read Lauren's question, my immediate response was everybody's accountable at all levels, right? Because we all share the planet. Not being romantic about it, but we do. So we're all accountable. And there is regulation out there, as we've established. Organisations have to set their science-based targets and they're going to be measured against them, and they've had to set the transition plans. So measuring and tracking that, I think, is critical. But I also think citizens need to take accountability for their role in this as well, because we can't just do one part and not the other. And it comes back to how do we engage citizens and make it easy and put the information available so they understand how they can take part in this. And we do talk about, an engagement strategy, giving them the right information, but I don't think we are yet consistently pushing that. I think it comes in spurts and stops and starts. People need to recognise this is a core part of life, not just an addition to the side of it. Because, when we talk about incentivisation, and I think I mentioned when I talked about it, the say-do gap is really still quite significant. I was having a conversation with a different private sector organisation the other week, and they have their own targets and they've got their corporate objectives. And number 5 is net zero, but it's not at the heart of their business. But their number 1 is to be one of the top 25 employers of choice. So we had a really interesting debate about the workforce of tomorrow, the generations coming up. This is really important to them. If you want to be a top 25 employer of choice, you have to take this topic seriously. And so it's a real, Siobhan, carrot and stick, right? And it's a balance of both. But none of us, I think, can go away and say, I'm not accountable.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Neil, I mean, you mentioned I think that you were pleased that this new legislation is going to come in to protect marine environment. So 30% by 2030 protection of marine environment. So do you want to see more kind of legislation around this? But also, did you have any thoughts on how we can incentivize good behavior when it comes to, you know?
Yeah, no, I have just thought, so I mean, certainly it's a balance, isn't it? You've got to, between regulation and incentives. I think one of the challenges we've seen in marine space is regulation has struggled to keep pace with how fast things are moving. So it's not quick to change regulatory systems, but the demands being placed on them are changing very fast, and government needing to respond to that and ensure that you've got regulatory regimes that can adapt to the changing things we're needing to do for net zero. And the thing I'll say kind of on incentives and advice as well is that, again, the organisation we work with and businesses we work with, most are trying to do the right thing and want to do the right thing as businesses. They've got some often ambitious sort of targets they've set themselves about wanting to do things on net zero and on biodiversity. Changes they don't quite know how always to measure that performance. So some of the stuff we've been doing with businesses is about kind of really good performance indicators to help them measure how well they're doing against some of their sort of aims or goals that they might have sort of publicly set. So it's quite easy, and then Charlotte just saying between say and do, it's quite easy to say the right things at the moment, and a lot of businesses are saying the right things, but how are they held to account for that? Whether that's through regulation or in many cases by shareholders, by employees, by others, but being much more transparent about what are those key indicators. How do you develop something that works for your business that really shows whether you're achieving those things that you're setting out to do?
Thanks, Neil. Okay, I'm moving on. I've got 2 questions that have come in and I want to connect them both, and then I'm going to ask it for all of you, because although one of them was directed to you, Charlotte, I think it's relevant for everybody. So the first question came in from Oladele, who said, thank you, Charlotte, for talking about turning strategy into pacey delivery, strategy and policy into delivery, but is enough being done on co-creation and, for example, incorporating the needs of people reflecting different regional differences? So Selvin, this might be a kind of levelling up issue as well. So are we thinking about regional differences when it comes to delivery? And I want to connect this to a question that Ruth has just messaged in, which is some of these kind of solutions might be more difficult for people on middle incomes. So people on benefits might get grants. Those who are rich can afford to pay, but middle earners don't get help, and they're being squeezed basically by the cost of living crisis. So I think there's an issue here about the extent to which government are bringing citizens with them, whether that's a regional issue or whether it's a kind of income issue. And is there more that can be done on kind of co-creation of some of these solutions? Selvin, I'm coming back to you, your thoughts on this.
The fantastic thing about this agenda is that it does very much lend itself to the levelling up agenda. And obviously, being a data geek, you can match a load of different data indices of multiple deprivation across fuel poverty, across where the supply chain is strongest, across households needed to be done. Counterintuitively, a larger proportion of social housing that is needed to be upgraded is actually in London and the South East. A lot of people might think that it would be in the North, for example. So, and then in terms of the green jobs that we all want to see, they have to be very hyper local. So you create the jobs in the area where you've got the poor housing stock, the G's, the E's, the F's that you want to upgrade. And of course, these jobs are semi-skilled jobs. They're very well paid for some of the jobs that might be in the particular region, for example. So yeah, I think we're having quite a big impact on the levelling up agenda, and of course we want to see that continue. I think one of the challenges we've got is to kind of sell to the schools, the colleges, the careers advisors, the options that will be available into the future, and to try and get them to see the potential for people in this, in the subjects they study, and the kind of the technical things that they go on to qualify in. But we're very, very excited about the levelling up agenda in relation to this work.
Thanks, Selwyn. And Stephen, maybe picking up more on Ruth's point about affordability of some of these, because you mentioned one of your priorities now was looking at kind of equality issues and protection of the most vulnerable, for example. But what about Ruth's point that there's this group of people in the middle, maybe, who are getting squeezed because they don't qualify maybe for some of the support around some of these new schemes?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I was thinking, you know, while the conversation was going on, kind of how different areas impact in different ways. So I think this is where we come back to the need for the transition itself to be managed in a way perhaps we haven't done so well at in the past in this country. And I give you a specific example here in Zurich, in Switzerland. You know, Switzerland's very they have a very sort of plebiscite-based democracy, so they have lots of kind of people, regular referendums. They are switching whole sections of the city off, in fact the whole city eventually, off of the reticulated gas network. So they're turning the gas taps off and transferring people over to other forms of heating and energy supply for their housing. It's taken them 20 years to get from start to finish, but they started much before we did. And I think the lessons to be sort of transferred through there is that they've supplied support for all in society, but the support is tailored as to how it's needed, and they've engaged citizens in that process to maintain, I come back to that point I made earlier around, to maintain that consumer consent through the process. So you haven't had wholesale sort of mis-selling and that kind of thing going on. We're behind the game in that sector in the UK, but I'm sure some talk about heat in housing. But, you know, in terms of how it directly impacts people in the middle in the UK, it's different depending on the different sectors. You know, some measures are actually quite cheap and easy to install, home installation, that kind of thing. We've seen kind of quite significant take up, I understand, around there, and government has incentivized all through removing VAT. And so I think there is a feed through to those people in the middle. And I guess the other side of it is some of these solutions weren't very sexy 5 or 10 years ago, but now most people, I think, an electric car is actually, I mean, there's a bit of bad news out there, and I would say misplaced information out there. But, you know, the Teslas of this world have kind of trailblazed, and yes, they're very expensive, but costs are coming down, and we will see that continuing to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. And, you know, we've seen, for example, Norway very successfully transition to electric vehicles.
Thanks, Stephen. Charlotte, you were nodding there to some of what Stephen said. So your thoughts both on kind of the regional implications and also the cost of some of these solutions.
Yeah, and I suppose I was nodding. I really like Stephen's point on we need to manage this differently than potentially anything we've done before, because it comes back to the point we talked earlier about systems thinking. It is a whole system view, and we need to recognise not everybody's starting at the same point, and how do we support those that need more? It's not enough just to say, well, that's how it is. You know, we really have to manage it, and that's where I think, you know, the governance, the convener and manager of that, I think is really important. I was nodding also and smiling at the comment about, you know, how do we have this co-creation environment but allow for regional difference? And I think that's spot on. I was lucky enough to be involved in some local authority conversations a couple of weeks ago, where they are, you know, actively looking at setting challenges and grants out to regions where they're asking industry to come and solve some of their decarbonisation pathway challenges. But they're not being prescriptive, saying, I want one of these and I want one of those. They're doing it very much from an outcomes lens. Come and tell us, we've got a pot of funding for you to bring us some innovations for where we can move the dial on some of these decarbonisation pathways. But the bit I really loved about it is they were proactively championing an ecosystem and looking for a support partner that would just manage all the knowledge and learning, because actually everybody can rock up and make the same mistakes. So how do we proactively bottle that learning and share it across the region? And then you go further and you go, yes, all these regions will have a set of challenges that they commonly face, but some of them may have nuances to the point of, you know, there are different regional needs.
Yeah.
How do we get trailblazers in the different regions? And that's been touched on, I think, in various government reports. But how do we really get ahead and accelerate that? And how do we not just use, I mean, you've set me off a little tangent here, actually. I was in the West Coast a couple of weeks ago, and we were working with year 10s, and we were asking them to come up with ideas of how we could improve the transport network to tell policymakers what they wanted differently. And it was wonderful, the ideas we came up with, that they came up with, that they wanted. Why aren't we doing the same in regions?
Yeah.
That's the thing that excites me the most.
Yeah. Thanks, Charlotte. And we've got another question about learning, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, and sharing learning. But Neil, I wanted to ask you, you feel free to come in on that question if you want, but there's a specific question that's come in for you as well, which I think is probably more relevant for you. And this was from Lauren again, and she said, do you think that the mainstream media report the facts that you stated? So you mentioned a lot of those facts about how important the marine environment is and the potential damage that's being done. Do you think that's being reported fairly and honestly and with the urgency that it is required? So I think it's about communication to people. Are we getting that kind of the facts out and the information out to the public as well as you would like to see it?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I mean, just on the form one, I guess just one quick observation around, I guess, the role of coastal communities. So coastal communities, some of the most deprived around the UK, but yeah, have a huge opportunity here in terms of things like offshore wind development and others like that to sort of really be regenerated. So I think, you know, there's again another good link between some of this work and some of the work on levelling up. And very close to our high seacoast, we're based in Lowestoft in Suffolk, which is a town with some particular economic challenges, you know, and looking to make the most of the opportunities from, you know, offshore marine renewable energy. And I think on the question about kind of how these things are reported, I guess how science is reported generally by the media, well, it's mixed, isn't it? You know, we sort of see really good reporting, really kind of people who do it really well. Some outlets are very good at it. Others, it's much more sensationalist or absent kind of at times. And I guess we have to watch that risk of people becoming desensitized to the kind of latest sort of screaming headline about kind of the damage that climate change is causing, or kind of, or how difficult the sort of doom and gloom bit. So as I say, some I think do it really well. I think it's not just in the kind of news side, but we were talking before it started about for us in CFAS, the Blue Planet programme. So the BBC's Blue Planet programme has been transformative in, I think, people's understanding of the issues that are affecting the marine environment, and also kind of what we need to do about it. And, you know, when they ran a programme that was about marine plastics and plastic pollution, you know, almost single-handedly it changed the country's view on that issue, and then opened up the opportunity for huge amounts of kind of new, both kind of consumer action, business action, and kind of government action as well. So I think that's the challenge, is how do we get good informed reporting of kind of science that's out there in a way that people can understand. And something I work with our scientists a lot in CFAS is about how do we communicate the work that we're doing, because, you know, there's lots of, it's complex, you know, it's detailed, but actually we've got to be able to get that message across, explain to people what's happening, and more importantly, kind of what are the solutions to some of this that science can help us develop.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to that issue of communication, because I think it's really important, because I think it'll be interesting to get other people's views on who the right people might be to be the face of some of that communication. But also I think there's a increasing amount of media interest in the kind of anti-net zero kind of agenda as well. So it'd be interesting for people's thoughts on that. But I want to come to Ian Cable's question as well, which goes back to what Charlotte was saying. So I'm going to come to you first on this one, Charlotte, which was, do you think that as we learn by doing on addressing shared challenges, we need to increase peer learning and collaboration across government bodies? So we've talked a lot about the need for collaboration across sectors. Do we do enough of collaboration across government bodies? So even just within government departments, as a key part of accelerating our kind of journey towards net zero. Charlotte, you work with different public bodies. Do you think that joining up is being done? I think the answer might be quite short to this one, but do we need to see more collaboration?
So in short, I think we do need more join up and learning across, right? So we don't use negatives, we just need more of. And it's, but it's easy to say that, isn't it? But it's how do we help do that? Like, there's lots of, in the CC report that came out yesterday, they've called out a set of recommendations, and they've called out specific departments across government to action those recommendations. And some are specific departments like Selvin's World, but some are multiple departments have the same recommendation. So with that, immediately we've got a clear direction of how we can join up. And I come back to my favorite saying, which is we need to team up to speed up and win the race. And that's really what motivates me all the time. So actually looking at where different government departments are on their journey, how can they, build on, learn from. So if Department X has got so far, right, how do I take that and build on it rather than starting back at the beginning and accelerate forward? So it kind of links into the comment I made earlier about the conversation I'd had with the local authority. They're doing the same things in regions. I think it's almost like super scaling that. And it's a complex problem, but we can get the basics right. Like, how do we share the information? How do we get easy knowledge transfer? So that stuff isn't hard. We do have the technology. Let's share it.
Yeah.
I think, Stephen, you've got your hand up, so maybe you want to build on it.
Yeah, over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Charlotte. I mean, we're finding ourselves kind of agreeing on pretty much everything. But I mean, I can't not respond to this, given the role of UKRN is in promoting collaboration and making it happen. So it's been a big focus of what we've been doing across our regulator members on net zero, bringing in experts, engaging each other on what works best and where is how I would put it, recognizing that sometimes you can't necessarily apply the same solutions across quite different areas of regulation, but there's been quite a lot of transfer of knowledge and information through that process, and we can do a lot more, and we're trying to do a lot more, and it's kind of where I'm quite excited about the potential follow-up to the Skidmore recommendation is that if we can kind of broaden that collaboration to other regulators outside of the UKRN membership, specifically including the Environment Agency and HSE, but others as well as government bodies, then I think that puts us at a different level. But we've got to make sure we've got the mechanisms to help make that work and to bring about that cooperation and alignment that we really need to get that system thinking working in practice. Just one other point, I was just reflecting back, quite a few of our members are also doing quite a lot around communicating to consumers, including at point of purchase. The Civil Aviation Authority at the moment have a project running where they did quite a lot of research now looking at point of sale, much better information to consumers about the carbon impact of flight choices, for example. So I think we are kind of doing more and more collectively on that. The challenge, as always, is not to overload consumers and get the right level of information. It was always a big challenge in the energy space around green tariffs and more widely around tariff purchases. And I think that is, again, something we need to keep collaborating and make sure we learn the lessons and give consumers the best and easiest accessible information for the right people. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Charlotte, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, Stephen, you just triggered something for me when you're talking, which is around, when we're talking about the learnings and the collaboration, it's not to lose the pragmatism. So, we've talked for the past hour about getting the right strategy and policy into action, but also our roles as organisations as emitters. And often when I talk to clients, it's quite a daunting challenge and they don't know where to start. So how do you chop the elephant up and what are the little bits? So, one of the common things we often talk to organisations about, and we've done it with some government departments, is their IT estate. Something practical, something everybody has, and actually baselining the emissions of your IT estate and how do you change that is a fairly practical thing that you can grasp. And actually, by doing it, you will baseline the cost. So just because you're on the cloud doesn't mean the cloud's green. Are you using the cloud in the right way? Is it optimized? How are you using your data centers? And all this stuff, actually, if you improve it, you'll get your energy bill down. You'll get your cost of IT infrastructure down. These are all things that help our organizations where we've got probably constrained resources and demands on resources for other things. So sharing some of those pragmatic learnings and almost quick wins, I think, is a really useful way to make it real.
Thanks. Selvin, I'm interested in because obviously you kind of sit in the department that leads on all of these issues. From where you sit, is that joining up happening? Is there more collaboration now than there was previously, or is there a lot more that could be done based on what Stephen and Charlotte have already said?
So, I mean, you can always collaborate more and join up more, as you know from your time in government, Siobhan. I think that the current approach, which has, as it were, gained shares across a number of departments, DFT, DEFRA, obviously Energy Security Net Zero Department, makes sense, and you can see the pathways that support those shares. I think that increasingly, though, there's got to be more. The previous question was the right one. There's got to be more learning and learning by doing that happens right way through Whitehall and into those local communities. And so in my own neck of the woods, we have a learning community which is made up of housing associations and local authorities who are learning by doing and transferring the knowledge of what they've been doing and how they've been doing it across what is in some cases very similar building stock or typologies, so that not everybody has to learn the same thing in the same area at different times. It can be cross-transferred. I mean, it's an enormous challenge, obviously. I think one of the things that the task force is particularly going to be helping us with is the interlocutor piece between the public and the private, not just public funding, but what are the things that government needs to do to unlock that private capital investment, and that kind of stuff. So what kinds of standards and certainty do the banks need in order to put green capital finance behind a particular thing and know that it will be a green outcome and they will be able to rely on it? Yeah.
Thanks, Selvin. And Neil, in terms of kind of joining up and collaboration, I mean, you stressed the importance of making sure that as policymakers think about some of these more sustainable solutions, they consider nature-based solutions and not doing damage to the environment with some of the solutions. Why are those conversations not happening? Are the right people not together in the room at the moment? And how can we get better at having those joined up conversations?
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. I think first thing to say, it's much better now than it kind of used to be, I think, in my experience. So when I was in the department that Selvin's in now, working on kind of low carbon technologies, almost we were set up to compete with each other in terms of who could deliver their technology kind of the fastest. And there was a benefit to that, but it didn't mean you had the collaboration that we now see, I think, across government, across departments. It is much, much better than it was, but clearly still more to do. And I think, as we've been discussing, the more we do, the more we realise how many other things we've got to bring into this. So, when we're looking at transport issues, when we're looking at buildings or housing issues, how do we ensure that the individuals kind of have that broader understanding of kind of all these different issues that they need to come together? So some of it is about helping people build those skills, have the right expertise together to do it. But it's difficult, there's a lot of things happening in government, a lot of teams kind of head down trying to deliver really kind of challenging kind of objectives, and it's how do you kind of create a space for people to keep looking around and bringing those conversations together. And as I say, on the nature and the climate stuff, again, there's a lot of really positive stuff happening in this space. People, I think, now understand the need to tackle these two big issues together, but we've got to kind of bring that into everybody in every local authority and every kind of part of the people delivering this to be thinking both about what we can do for net zero and what we can do for nature in tandem.
Thanks, Neil. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. I think this will be the final question and we'll have to keep the answers quite short. But I want to come back, Selvin, you mentioned right at the beginning, and I think other people have touched on it throughout, the Climate Change Committee report that came out yesterday, and the issue of kind of providing information for people and businesses and being clear on kind of what's required has come up throughout the presentations. And I noticed in one of the key messages from the report yesterday, they state the need to kind of empower and inform, they say households, but I guess it could be businesses as well, and communities to make those low carbon choices. So I think my final question is kind of what more can the government be doing to make sure that everybody has the information that they need, the facts that they need, but also is there a danger, I think, that especially with the cost of living crisis, there is this growing narrative in our media that it's a trade-off between net zero and kind of costs, you know, that actually we should be parking net zero over here because we have to tackle with the cost of living crisis over there. And I'm certainly seeing more of that in the media at the moment. So how do you kind of make sure that people have the information that they need and also maybe bat off some of those narratives around we shouldn't be looking at net zero at the moment? I'm going to shake up the order a little bit. Stephen, I'm starting with you, and we will have to keep the answers quite short, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's a lot to answer, but I'll just focus on one area, I think, and I think it's just around, I think we need to be really persistent and clear as communicators as to the fact that a lot of these net zero measures are of benefit to consumers in terms of lowering costs and actually quite short timescales, but certainly in the medium term. One example would be just around wind versus gas. There was quite a lot of debate around relative costs, but through the gas price crisis, we're looking at 11 times cheaper for wind compared to gas. And it took, I think it was, it took many attempts to get that into the press, but eventually it got in there. And this is where we just have to be persistent. It's the same with some of the stuff that's going around EVs at the moment. So, we need to get the information out there. We need to get the information on things like life cycle analysis to kind of squash, I think, where there is misinformation going on.
Thanks, Stephen. So consistency and persistence there. Neil, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Stephen, I mean, I think, we're going in the right direction. I think it's a matter of keep pushing that, that net zero is not just a kind of the right thing to do, but a better future for people as well, with kind of lower cost, whether that's in their housing from insulation or from, their kind of electric cars from not having to buy petrol. There's a lot of benefit to this. The costs are coming down, energy costs are coming down. I think, almost now is a time to be able to make that argument as well when people are concerned about cost of living, that this is why we're investing in some of these things for the future. And then I think, as you say, more generally, it's about, making sure people have got the information they need, but also sometimes it is about kind of just regulating things. So actually taking away choices sometimes. So we did it with energy efficient light bulbs. Nobody really noticed that much, but had you gone through a whole process trying to persuade people to shift, that would have been very difficult. We're looking at doing the same on cars, on boilers, all these kind of things that actually sometimes you've got to kind of change the kind of choices that consumers have rather than just relying on behaviour change, which we know is slow and difficult.
Thanks, Neil. Charlotte, your final thoughts?
I think it's linked on both those points. One is around, standardising our approach to eco-labelling. So actually, you can compare apples with apples and understand what all this data means as a citizen and how my choices are impacting it. I touched on the carbon calculator concept at the beginning. There's lots of mechanisms out there that you can track your carbon impact as an individual, potentially as an organisation, but how do we make that easy and accessible? And it kind of fits with the wider, we report on net zero at government level, but how do we expand that and expand it in a way that's like digestible? Because to Stephen's point about the trade-off of net zero versus cost, and to Neil's point, I think bringing that to life in like scenarios, use cases, me as an individual, you as an organisation. Today it might be more expensive, but in the long term, it won't be. And if you come back to the point of opportunity cost, if you demonstrate the cost of inaction today is going to impact you later by X, it helps you make a more informed decision.
Thanks, Charlotte. Selvin, we started with you. I'm going to finish with you for your thoughts.
Great. So I agree with the Committee on Climate Change. When we did the automatic enrolment pensions, we had a landing page. It was for intermediates, for people receiving pensions and for employers. And we are on our way to building something very similar. So we're doing the same for citizens that we're doing for businesses currently. You can already go to .gov.uk and get consumer advice information. It could be better. We need to do more. And as I say, next month we're connecting that experience where you can check your home against the EPC certificate, find out what you need to do to improve it further, because it is a journey. You're not going to do everything probably all at the same time. And you can connect from next month to the government schemes and ask either your local authority or energy company to come and start you on your journey and upgrade your home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selvin. Well, sadly, we are out of time. I have to say, I often get quite frustrated and angry when we're having conversations around kind of net zero, because I feel like, you know, there's so much more to be done. And I think you were all very honest in saying there is more to be done, but I'm left actually feeling quite positive after this conversation in terms of hearing about the progress that has been made, but also that sense that people are now coming together and they know that they need to be collaborating across sectors, across departments, across different parts of society. And then really that focus on empowering people and businesses and departments with the information they need to make the right choices. So I think there's a lot of hope there. So thank you so much to our fantastic panel, to Charlotte, to Stephen, to Selvin and to Neil for giving us so much of your time and your expertise, really much appreciated. Thank you for Deloitte again for being our knowledge partner. Thanks to the great audience for sending in so many good questions. And just to say to the audience, we will be sending around a short questionnaire that will be in your inbox. If you could just take a couple of minutes to fill that in, I'd be hugely grateful. It means that we will continue to give you the webinars on topics that are of most relevance to you and most useful for you. So thank you for that. To everybody, we will be sending around a link of this recording so you can watch the whole webinar again, or you can share it with your colleagues if you think it will be useful for them. And there will be an article with a write-up of today's discussion as well that will come around in a week or so. And again, you will all get that and you can share that with anyone who you think will find it useful. Thank you to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are, and I hope we see you again very soon. Thanks a lot, everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.